Right. Hello, everyone. We are finally in for the first video of 2024 now that the new year has begun. My original plan was to get on last week, but unfortunately, right around New Year's came about and I ended up catching a pretty nasty cold. And I just didn't feel all that well up to it last week to really get into it as I was trying to get over whatever bug or whatever it was that I had. I'm mostly gotten over it at this point, so I decided, you know what, we're going to go ahead and do it. I'm not putting this off any longer. So I know it's a week delayed, but we are finally getting into this year. So for the first video of this year, I know the end of last year, we kind of covered a lot into revolutions. That was not in any way intended. It just kind of played out like that. Now today it is a revolution, but it's a different type of revolution. This is not a political revolution. This is not a war revolution. This is a societal revolution and change of how the world operates. One that is actually probably going to take us at least a good 2 videos to actually kind of look at the impact that it has had. And we're living still in technically a third one of these, and that would be the Industrial Revolution, the transition of the world from an agrarian slash handicraft economy, what we used to have prior to the 18th century, to one that has become dominated by industry and machine manufacturing. There has really been 2 solid industrial revolutions that have already pretty much occurred. The first industrial revolution, what we call the first one, began in Britain around 1760. By 1850, this had affected most of the countries in what we would call the West, the Western countries, the ones that Russia hates so much. And by 1850, most of the Western countries had begun their process of industrialization. And then there is the argument that toward the latter half of the 19th century into the first half of the 20th, we have what they call the Second Industrial Revolution, which kind of takes up a whole different meaning with terms of what exactly they're changing and implementing into society. I would even say nuclear power might even fall at the very end of the second industrial revolution. It's kind of on the borderline, but it would definitely be included in one of the two. And then there is the whole argument that as of right now, as we speak, we're undergoing a third industrial revolution. And I think it's more than obvious that we are. And this one dealing, of course, primarily with the very platform here that we're using now, and that's that everything's going digital. Everything's becoming digitized, and it's going from simply electronic to everything digital. I mean, even you can sign a paper digitally now. You can submit everything digitally now. You can teach digitally. You can, stream digitally. There's becoming less of a need for physical media as there once was anymore. Not saying I entirely agree with that, but the point that everything is becoming digital, that in itself is a third industrial revolution. That's a major change in how society is operating and working. So what we're looking at today for the first video over this is just kind of the basics. As we kind of went over with the French Revolution, I wanted to cover with this one, as I kind of plotted it out, it would be better to cover the basics of what the first and second industrial revolutions were. We're going, of course, with the ones that have already occurred, not the one that is occurring now, because we don't know fully what the impacts of that will be historically. We have a good idea of what they will be, but we won't know until it's over. But with the third, we're kind of leave that out. So with the second and first, we're going to look at primarily what were their characteristics and some of the important events that kind of occurred during them. We're not going to so much touch upon the specific innovations and inventions of the first and second industrial revolutions. I think it would be best if we talked about them in a separate video just so they can get their own proper attention, so that we can really point out some of the more significant devices and machines that come out from that time period, instead of trying to mush it all into one big long video that was almost 2 or 3 hours long. So for the purpose of this one, we're simply going to look at the basic history, the basic events that occur during the first and second industrial revolution, and some of the characteristics that they really bring about that change and revolutionize how society operates. So, with the characteristics, I guess, is where we're going to start here. And we have 3 main features that become involved with the first and second industrial revolutions. And those fall into the categories of technological, socioeconomic, and cultural characteristics. Now, the technological changes. This is probably the most diverse of the 3 characteristics that, of course, comes about. Because, as we all know, the Industrial Revolution is key to bringing about the modern world. So, the first thing that's going to come about in the technological change is there's going to be a use of new basic materials like iron and steel. Now, iron had existed, of course, iron's always been here. People had used iron in parts before, even thousands of years. But on terms of mass production and building and construction with it, it wasn't a very common feature to use until the Industrial Revolution makes it both cheaper to do so and more in the production value of iron, the output of being able to, make it into things goes up with the use of the factory method and everything else. It really increases their ability to really work with iron. And of course, through working with iron and getting impurities out of that, you can in turn turn it into steel, which is an even harder building material. But that is going to be a major change here is we're going to see the use of new basic materials that have not really been messed with all that much before. Before this, we're still largely using wood. We're still using, more plentiful natural resources that are renewable, cheaper to use, but they're also more easily to be lost. And with now, we're going to be using more metals. The second one that we're going to see is a use of new energy sources, both fuels and motive power. This is going to include things such as using coal. The steam engine is going to come about, taking steam produced off of boiling water and then using that to turn the wheels or turbines of an engine and getting that to go. We're going to have electricity come about, especially toward the second industrial revolution. That's going to become a thing. Oil, using oil as a fuel source, and even the internal combustion engine, which is probably the basis of all engines that exist today. That is going to be a major development during the Industrial Revolution. Again, we will definitely mention that in the other video because that is probably one of the top 5 most important innovations to come out of the Industrial Revolution was the modern combustion engine. We're also going to have the invention of new machines, which, of course, we all probably know some of those. Of course, we have like trains, railways come about. We have ocean liners, steamships that no longer have to have sails. Of course, we also have some tragedies involved with those. I'm sure that we could name a couple. We also have, what else we have here? New means of agricultural production. We have, I'm trying to think here. Field work is becoming more mechanized as we see today. We don't use horses and oxes anymore to really go about the field and plant. You have modern machines that do that for us. What else do we have here? With the cotton gins, that's in itself kind of a debated thing. The idea that it made cotton production easier was good, but the after impacts of what that also led to, extending slavery far beyond what it should have been, that was also a problem. It was never intended for that purpose. Well, of course, we have automobiles come out from this, the telegraph. There's just a whole sorts of things that come out of the Industrial Revolution that would be included in that category. For number 4, we have the new organization of work, the factory system that we see today in factories and how they operate with the means of production and producing and keeping their manufacturing standards up. That is going to come about during the Industrial Revolution. For number 5, developments in transportation and communication. So we're going to have, of course, automobiles, airplanes, steamships, telegraphs, radios. That's all going to come out of this in some way. And then number 6, which I believe is the last of the technological Yes, the last of the technological changes is number 6, and that's applying science to industry, which is going to lead to an increased use of natural resources in the mass production of manufactured goods on a scale that has never been seen before in human history. Because, mind you, before the Industrial Revolution comes out, there was manufacturing, yes, but it was more on the handicraft level. Individual, shopkeepers or business people would make these products themselves, or they'd have to hire a craftsman or somebody, and they couldn't do it on a mass production scale. It was an individual making these products, so production was a lot less. It was slower. It took longer, and by consequence, the goods were often much more expensive. Now, when the Industrial Revolution comes about, now you have someone producing these objects and products on a mass scale. They're able to produce them relatively quickly. They're able to produce a lot of them in a very short amount of time, which leads to the prices of these goods falling dramatically in most cases. Prices get cheaper as it's easier to manufacture and make more of them to meet demand. So, what were some of the non-industrial improvements that we see with the first and second industrial revolutions? Well, we're going to have roughly about five of these, and these are non-industrial. So, these are not going to all the time deal with in terms of technology. And the first one we're going to have about is agricultural improvements are going to come, made it possible for larger food production, which will sustain larger populations. The human population of Earth had stayed actually relatively steady. It didn't grow dramatically for almost our first, I, I mean, pretty much it's not much time has passed. So we'll say almost the entire 10,000 or however many thousands of years it's been that humanity has been on this Earth. Modern humanity, I should say. What is it, like 12,000, 10,000 years? I think it's around there. I'm not 100% certain since modern man came on the picture. But in our entire history of being on this planet, the human population, it didn't grow that quickly. Now nowadays, I think we just what did we cross? Like the 8 billion mark just a year or two ago? Let me double check here because I want to point out just how remarkable it is that the Industrial Revolution makes it possible for the human population globally to expand to a level that we had never seen before. It's actually quite shocking in terms of, the food advances because beforehand it was a struggle to get enough food. It was a absolute struggle to get enough food produced to meet large human populations, and because of that, human mortality rates prior to the Industrial Revolution were quite high because it was very common for food shortages and famines to take place on this planet. Now, let me see here. As of right now, in 2024, we have 8.1 billion people that are living as of right now on this planet. Now, as for the world population, I don't think the human population crossed the 1 billion mark until, let me see here when it was. Of course, this will never make it easy, does it? Did. In 1804, right during the middle of the first industrial revolution, is when the human population for the first time reaches 1 billion people. So, mind you, that was a little over 200 years ago that we even reached 1 billion. And that took almost 10,000 years. And in the span of just a little more than 200 years, that number has gone up by times 8. That just shows you the dramatic impact it's had on the way that humans are able to actually survive and humans are able to actually increase their survivability due to the increased food production and other safety factors that come in with the Industrial Revolution. And this is also going to support cities, of course, getting larger. More urban centers are going to be able to support their large populations, and that's going to encourage more people to not only stay within them, but also move to them. So the second non-industrial improvement that we have that comes about is going to be the economic changes are going to result in wider distribution of wealth and increased international trade and the decline of land as a source of wealth. Now, historically, prior to the Industrial Revolution, we had that little thing up through the Middle Ages, especially in Europe at least, that whole feudalism thing, where basically the lords owned the land and then their serfs would work the land for them, but in return the lords gave them, shelter and food and some means of, sustaining themselves. But if you owned land, you were pretty well set. If you didn't own land, you were probably pretty poor. Landowners owned a lot of the capital. During the Industrial Revolution, when that changes, because now the economic changes are going to lead to that wealth getting distributed, because now it's not so much on who owns land, because you can just go work in a factory and actually make a good amount of money. But then at the same time, that distribution of wealth doesn't always trickle down because who's going to ultimately own the factory? The wealthy, business people. It's not going to be the common worker at the bottom, and there's very little chance the common low life laborer on the bottom is ever going to rise to the top, at least at that time. I mean, nowadays that's also becoming an issue. The third non industrial improvement political changes would reflect the shift in economic power, new state policies corresponding to the needs of an industrial society. So, we're going to have quite a bit of political change going to come about. The wealthy landowning class is going to rapidly no longer really become the political elite, and now it's going to be the wealthy business owners. I mean, one prime example you could see here is in the United States. Take the United States during that time, during the 19th century. During the first half in the South, the South didn't really industrialize until after the Civil War. The North did prior to the Civil War. The North had already become quite industrialized, and the means of power up there was more focused on who owned the big businesses up north. In the South, it was still in the hands of an agrarian elite planter class who owned the massive plantations and fields along with the slaves that they owned. And after the Civil War, that changed. And after the Civil War, the United States starts going through what we would also call it's the Gilded Age, where it seems like society's good, but underneath it all, there's massive issues such as the unequal distribution of wealth because you have these big tycoons at the top, such as the Vanderbilts, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, who are rapidly forming these massive trusts and monopolies, and very little of that wealth is actually getting down to the bottom people. And at the same time, these are the same people pulling strings in the government who, even like today, there's definitely some tycoons that do that today. I mean, look at Jeff Bezos, look at Elon Musk, look at, you know, any rich, powerful billionaire today has some sort of lobbying political power to try to get the government to not really mess with them, try to keep them off their back. And basically, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. But in turn, that creates a lot of inequality. The fourth non industrial improvement that we're going to have is a sweeping social change, which is going to lead to, of course, the growth of cities. We're going to have development of a working class movement, such as labor movements, that are going to really come about during the Industrial Revolution where they had not existed before. And for the fifth and final one, we have cultural transformations on a broad scale, such as here are some examples of what some of those cultural transformations are going to be coming out of these industrial revolutions. The craftsmen are going to turn into machine operators. That's a big change. We're going to have workers that are going to acquire new and distinctive skills that they would never have learned if they remained handymen or craftspeople. And we're going to have one major psychological change that kind of comes out of the Industrial Revolution, and that's going to be the confidence in the ability to use resources and to master nature is heightened. The human mind has this feeling that we've conquered nature, we've conquered the world, and we are now sitting on the top and we have mastered our ability to use resources. We've reached the top of the chain. In one instance, this kind of reminds me of is ironically one of my favorite and also possibly one of the saddest episodes in history, but it's also one of my favorite topics in history, and that is of course of the RMS Titanic, where the Titanic before she sank was pinnacled as, top of the line, a product of the industrial age. She was record breaking for her day for the amenities and just the ingenuity that went into crafting her and her three sisters. They were some of the grandest liners that had ever been built at the time, and they were some of the most structurally sound. Only in 5 days after setting sail, the thing sank due to a block of ice and killed a bunch of people. And for a short time, there was the question in the shipbuilding industry, did we really overestimate our ingenuity when we built this thing? Have we become too overconfident in ourselves to believe that we're immune from such accidents from occurring? And that kind of came about, I think, out of that psychological idea that had taken place during the Industrial Revolution that, we've conquered nature. We've conquered, we are the masters of using our resources and producing things and making things, that we're blind to the fact that there's still the possibility for things to go wrong. So that brings us out of the characteristics. So let's dive in here to a little bit of the basic event history, and we're going to cover the first Industrial Revolution first. So this is going to take place roughly between 1760 and 1830. The Industrial Revolution, of course, began in perhaps the only logical place it could have began in the 18th century, or begun, and that was Great Britain. Great Britain is where all this all started. The wonderful British slash English, whatever you want to call them, they are the key to this all. Now, you might ask, why Britain? Why couldn't any other country have had this start during, the 18th century? Why was it Britain that started? Well, let's think of Britain's historical power on the world stage. At one time, Britain had the largest empire in world history. It was the old saying that the sun never set on the British Empire, mostly because they were so expanded around the world that at any given time, there was a British territory that had sunlight. It was daytime in some British territory, no matter what time of day, no matter where in the world you were. It was just that large. And that same massive global empire is what's going to fuel and allow Britain to go under the Industrial Revolution first compared to any other nation. That massive empire is going to give them a massive reserve and access to the resources and material that they're going to need to undergo this industrial change. And Britain was aware of its head start over other nations. It wasn't blind to the factor that it had a very distinct advantage compared to everyone else on the global stage. Britain realized this pretty quick. And the British government, upon realizing they had this massive advantage, and they were started to undergo industrialization, they ended up forbidding the export of any machinery, of skilled workers. So the British, of course, are going to have the skilled workers now, and we're going to have the manufacturing techniques that Britain is going to employ. These are all going to be forbidden from export by the British government. The British government realizes we have a monopoly going on here with industrialization. We don't want the rest of Europe catching up to us. So what we're going to do is we're going to hide this from the rest of Europe. We're going to ban anybody from taking it out of the country. So you can't take out our machinery, you can't take out our skilled workers, and you can't sell our manufacturing techniques to try to maintain our monopoly on it. They knew eventually that it was probably going to get out, but the longer they could prevent it from doing so, the better. The better it would benefit Britain if they could. Of course, that's not going to last forever, as wealthy British businessmen saw profitable opportunities abroad. Because if your entire country is industrialized at this point, what's the profit in trying to, go against other industrialists? You could make a killing off going to one of these other countries in Europe that hasn't begun the process of industrialization, because you'd be the first one to do it. You would have a monopoly on your own in terms of, profits, bringing this industrial revolution there. And they saw profitable opportunities abroad. And you also had, of course, incentive from other continental European nations where they seen what was going on in Britain. They wanted to get a hold of that themselves. We want to build railways. We want to build, some iron bridges. We want to get, better, societal changes and factories. you know, so we want that. So continental European business people also were seeking to lure British knowledge into their countries, or trying to incent them, like, oh, please, we'll give you this if you come here and open a business. Please, please. So they're waiting. So that, mind you, the first industrial revolution started in 1760. It doesn't leave until 1807. The industrial revolution is maintained in Britain. That's how long Britain maintained a monopoly for. Well over 40 years, almost 50. I think, what would it be, 47 years that they maintained that monopoly. But in 1807, it finally gets out of Britain, because in 1807, English businessmen William and John Cockerell brought the Industrial Revolution to Belgium, of all places. Now, mind you, Belgium at that time was not yet a fully independent nation. That wouldn't occur until 1830, but it was a very distinct region at the time. So in 1807, two English businessmen, the Cockerell brothers, they bring the Industrial Revolution to Belgium by opening machine shops at Liège. I hope I'm pronouncing that one right. I guarantee you I'm not, but I'm just saying it how I can say it. So they're going to open some new textile machine shops at Liège, and Belgium would become the first continental European nation that would become industrialized economically, of all places. By 1835, I believe, Belgium had its first railway go into effect. Now that's Belgium. Now, Belgium is a pretty small country, and Britain's always kind of been on good terms with Belgium. Now, like Britain, the Belgian Industrial Revolution is going to center on iron, coal, and textiles. These are the main things that are driving their Industrial Revolution. The production of iron for use in construction, the use of coal to produce steam, and of course, the making of cotton textiles and fabrics. Now, France, you would think that France is the next big country in Europe at that time. It's the next major power in Europe. You would think France would have been the second country to do it, but you got to keep in mind here, France had a complicated history with Industrial Revolution. It never really had a point where it just sprung off. France was much slower to industrialize than Britain or Belgium. Now, this is partly because France didn't exactly have a very good start to the 19th century during the time that the first Industrial Revolution was taking place, because we kind of just discussed this a couple weeks ago. Because when the first Industrial Revolution is starting to change Britain, when France, you would think France might also hop on the train at that moment and start undergoing its own. Keep in mind here, right when that's happening here in the late 18th century, what's France going through? France doesn't have a whole lot of money, it's bankrupt, and then the French Revolution comes about, and it leads to nothing but violence. And then this is followed, of course, by Napoleon's reign and the Napoleonic Wars. France, because of the political situation in France during the between 1789 and 1815, the large investments in industrial innovations was pretty much discouraged. Not to say that there weren't some. There were definitely some investments, but they were small and too far in between to really mark a big springboard for the Industrial Revolution to take a definitive leap in France during those years. It wouldn't be until after that was over that France would even really be able to continue moving toward on its Industrial Revolution. So by 1848, France had become an industrial power. So not till 1848, almost halfway through the 19th century, France finally became an industrial power on its own. However, it would still remain behind Britain despite the further growth that it would endure. France would never be on the level that Britain was. Now, many European countries would lag behind even France and them. They would lack the power, wealth, and opportunities to begin industrialization, and the political conditions within them also proved to be a hindrance. Now, you might say political conditions. What political conditions? Well, let's look at the example of a country that wasn't really able to industrialize until the political hindrances left. But the moment it did, it broke the records in one key industry, and that is actually Germany. Germany, up until 1871, there was no Germany. Germany was a bunch of German states from the former Holy Roman Empire, with, of course, the two most powerful being that of Austria and Prussia. And, of course, you had smaller ones such as Bavaria and Liechtenstein and I think Hanover was one. You had a bunch of German states. They were not unified. And because of that, although Germany was rich and had vast reserves of coal and iron, which would be very helpful for the steel industry, because they aren't politically unified and there's too much infighting going on and nationalistic tensions flaring up, Germany couldn't really begin industrial expansion until national unity was achieved in 1870 when the German states united under the German Empire. And once they do unite under the German Empire in 1870 at the end of the Franco-Prussian War, German industrial German industrial production grew extremely rapidly. In fact, by 1900, a mere 30 years after they had begun industrial expansion, Germany was outproducing even Britain in the means of steel. It was the world's leader in steel production and the world's leader in the chemical industry in just 30 years. Germany had perhaps one of the fastest industrial expansions in modern history. And the only hindrance that had really blocked them from doing it beforehand was they weren't politically unified. The moment they were, the Industrial Revolution explodes in Germany rapidly. Now, what about the United States? The United States isn't in Europe. When did we begin industrializing? Well, the United States actually began industrializing, I would say, at the very dawn of the 19th century. That whole period where Britain was largely successful in keeping a monopoly on its trade secrets, that didn't really last entirely. Excuse me. Because in 1793 is technically when we could claim that the United States ended up hitting with the Industrial Revolution, because you had Samuel Slater had come across and settled in Rhode Island, and he had brought trading secrets and operational secrets of how the British were running their textile mills. And in 1793, in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, he ended up founding Slater's Mill, which became America's first cotton water-powered textile mill, which would be the basis for many textile mills that would follow. This is a picture of that mill that you can still go to Massachusetts today and see. And in 1824, it was a further big event because this was also the site of America's first labor strike that occurred mostly by female workers in 1824. So in 1793, technically, we could claim the Industrial Revolution began to arrive in the United States, mostly because secrets began to arrive in the United States that had been leaked from Great Britain. And this is a picture of, I think, some of the equipment inside the mill that you can still go there and see today. I would actually, I wouldn't mind going there to see it myself. I believe the more famous textile mill that everyone's familiar with the United States' Industrial Revolution is, of course, the Lowell mills up in Lowell, Massachusetts, but that is more the 1830s, 1820s, I believe, that those really start talking about, well, coming about. They were not in the late 1790s. You also have the cotton gin, of course, came about in the 1790s in the United States, and that was its own innovation at the time. So then here we have the world's first iron bridge. This is still standing. It's still in use in Shropshire, England, and this was built in 1781. This is just one of the innovations that we're going to see come out of this time period, where they're able to make these, new innovations in engineering and structural construction that are really going to come about and made possible by the innovations that come about. So now, instead of using a wooden bridge, we have iron, which is a lot more sturdy and longer lasting. Here we have a picture of, like, I believe this is in England, but this is just a usual scene. So we have like a very early railway here in Britain, where we can kind of tell the train looks a little different. But what other thing is also going to we're going to kind of notice is the smokestacks from the factories, and that's also going to create a first in the world history. Before the Industrial Revolution, air pollution wasn't really a thing. Now it's going to be, because now you have all these chemicals going out in the air. So air pollution and environmental protection measures, they're also going to come about during the Industrial Revolution as a consequence to production, which is now polluting the air. Now we have to actually consider, for the first time in history, environmental regulations. And then here is a picture we have of the Krupp Steel Factory, and this is in Essen, Germany, 1864. This is a couple of years before Germany would unify, but after Germany unified, the Krupp Steel Company, which still exists to this day and have made steel for well over almost 2 centuries now, over 150 years in Germany. They are the nation's main steel manufacturer, and this is even before the Industrial Revolution had really hit Germany, but they were already in operation. But they would become the largest steel producer in the world eventually, because of the factor that Germany would lead the world in steel production and chemical production at a certain degree, which I'm sure didn't really get a good reputation when that also caused the Germans to be the first nation to use chemical warfare in the First World War. That was probably also a consequence of the fact that they had monopoly on the chemical industry, and they were very curious over how else could we employ chemicals maybe to win a war. But that's something that's going to come out of that as well. Now, the United States is not the only country that's going to have a rapid industrialization. Once the United States starts industrializing, it does so very rapidly, and eventually it actually outcompeted European efforts to industrialize. Now, another country that's kind of an oddball for industrialization was Japan. Japan, mind you, became very heavily industrialized, and it was one of the only Asian powers to ever do this. And this was partly because Japan had a pretty good relationship after their opening up in 1854. They had a pretty good trade relationship, I should say, with the United States and Great Britain, who were eager to kind of use it as a springboard into China in some ways. But Japan learned British and American trading and manufacturing secrets, and they ended up industrializing pretty much more than any other Asian nation did. I wouldn't even say China industrialized really to the extent that they did. And Japan industrialized pretty quickly as well. Now, by the early 20th century, the Eastern European countries such as Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, they are the ones that are going to be left behind. Now, why was this? Because they were all ruled by the Russian Empire. Russia was one of the last European states to industrialize. It was very late into the game. Russia didn't even get a transcontinental, country railroad, or the Trans-Siberian Railway, I think is the technical name here. But they didn't even get that, I think, until the 1890s. I don't think that's when I'm not even sure it was finished in the 1890s. I think it was like the early 1900s that it was finally finished. But Russia was very late into the industrialization game. I mean, look at the performance of Russia during World War One. That's part of the reason why, despite the fact that Russia had this massive army, the largest of any combatant country in the First World War, they relatively didn't do all that well in the First World War, because when going against Germany, who was perhaps one of the most industrialized powers in the world, and you guys have barely begun to industrialize, who do you think's going to have the better armaments and equipment and material there and transportation links? Germany's going to have that over you guys. It was not until the 5-year plans of the 1920s under Stalin that the Soviet Union, as Russia would later became an industrial power. So Russia didn't fully become industrialized until the 1920s during the Soviet Union. And by the 1950s, the revolution was just then industrializing nations like China and India, where China had been busy fighting, civil war and conflicts with each other internally. And it isn't until the 1950s, after the communist takeover, that they're able to really start committing into industrial investments. And as for India's sake, before 1947, India had been a British colony. India didn't have its own infrastructure entirely. Now, as for problems, what problems are we going to see come out of the Industrial Revolution? Well, we're going to have a couple of significant socioeconomic changes that are going to come about, and a couple of these are not exactly the best. Initial stages of the Industrial Revolution would see laborers' poverty worsen. The poverty of the common laborer is actually going to get worse, because although the idea is that the wealth will trickle down to them, like Republicans have trickle down economics today, which every economic study I've ever done is absolute bullcrap. It does not work as it is intended. It's kind of like communism. It sounds good on paper. It just doesn't work when you try to do it. And the same idea comes about with the early Industrial Revolution, that the wealth advances are going to just trickle down to the common laborer eventually. That doesn't ever really happen. Laborers actually get absolutely scampered, because their employment and wages depended on a costly production means that few of them could actually afford on their own. So there's little choice that they're going to get up in there, up higher into the factories. They're going to stay a common laborer. And of course, they're greedy factory owners. They're not willing to really cut their own profits, because their argument is, well, I'm paying enough for my own production means. Yeah, well, you got to pay your workers something. That's still a common problem today, and because of that, workers' wages didn't really fluctuate that much, even though the cost of living might have gone up a little bit. Job security was also a problem during the Industrial Revolution. There was not a whole lot of safety regulations and security measures in factories. It was actually pretty dangerous to work in one back then. There was workers that would frequently be displaced by technological improvements and large labor pools. One of the weird books that comes out during the, I think, second Industrial Revolution was early 1900s, and Theodore Roosevelt had used it as a reason for creating like the FDA to really monitor how food production went on in the United States, was The Jungle, where they listed all of these nasty and absolutely atrocious things that they saw in these food production plants that were going into the food that people were eating. Like, in a couple of cases, there were absolute mold growing on things. They were throwing dead rats, getting minced up with, byproduct meat and everything else. It was nasty. And it really inspired the federal government to actually start taking actions to actually oversee the production of food. We also had instances where in steel mills, people at times fell into the molten stuff or died in the mill. And instead of, telling authorities, nope, 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 nothing happened. Nothing happened at all. No one got killed. No one, got burned up alive at all. No, none of that happened. It was kind of ridiculous that they would allow this stuff to transpire without any kind of consequence. And because of that, that's a major problem. Now, we're also going to have the problem of a lack of worker protections is going to mean small wages, long working hours, because employers can basically make you work as long as they want because they know that you're going to really need the money. They're not going to wage your raise, but they'll say, okay, I'll give you a couple more hours, but I'm not going to raise your wage. And they're also going to have unsanitary tenements, unsanitary housing departments, because there's going to be so many workers and they don't want to spend the money to actually make them well. And there's going to be abuse and exploitation in the workplace. All these are problems coming out of the industrialization of society. These problems soon had new ideas developed that would come to address them. You had regulations coming into place to regulate how factories could operate, how many hours a worker could work a week, what the minimum wage, of course, is a regulation, how much the workers factories have to are obligated by law to pay their workers at a minimum. And you're also going to have the first major labor movements coming about. You're going to have unions, you're going to have labor, all kinds of things starting to sprout out. And that starts the eternal conflict between, of course, the big corporation and the labor union that is still going on to this day. And something else that I think I would mention in that, child labor. Child labor is also a problem during the first half of the 19th century. In fact, Britain by the 1840s was starting to take laws into effect to actually get rid of child labor, but it persisted in other industrialized countries well into the early 20th century. I mean, as we can see right here, the United States was still having to go on for the longest time. This is in a mill in textile mill, I think, in Macon, Georgia, in 1909. And these are two child laborers working on a machine, and they don't even have shoes. That's not exactly safe, and a child that age should not be working in a workplace. Excuse me. Now, as for all these changes that come about here, we're going to have eventually what some historians refer to as the Second Industrial Revolution, and that is going to come about in the 19th to early 20th centuries. And there's enough evidence to suggest that there was a distinct Second Revolution, but it's not on the large scale of the first. During the Second Industrial Revolution, modern industry began to exploit natural and synthetic resources that had not yet been utilized during the first. This is going to include lighter metals, rare earth metals such as uranium, like radioactive metals for nuclear fuel, new alloys, plastics, and new energy sources. Now, improvements in machines, tools, and computers would give rise to the automatic factory methods during the second half of the 20th century. We're also going to have, of course, the dawn of the nuclear age, the use of nuclear power for both, nuclear energy, for, making electricity and all kinds of affordable power and fuel. And we're also going to have the problem of nuclear weapons, which is still persisting to this day. So that's all going to be during the 20th century, during the Second Industrial Revolution. And this is also going to cause the ownership of the means of production is also going to see a change during the Second Industrial Revolution. In the 19th century, the means of production fell under oligarchical ownership, but during the second one, in the early 20th, this was going to start paving the way toward a wider distribution of ownership through the purchase of common stocks. As we all know nowadays, a lot of the ownership of companies goes into stocks. The stock market is big on the ownership of all kinds of major corporations, and that really didn't start up like in a major factor in terms of ownership until the early 20th century is when that's really going to start coming about. Nowadays, almost anybody can technically own a share of the Coca-Cola business company. You can buy Coca-Cola stock, be a shareholder. The second half of the 20th century is also going to see a change in the political theories toward the economy are also going to start happening. And this is primarily on the terms of what the government's role is in the economy. For most of the previous 2 centuries, the concept of the laissez faire economic ideas had prevailed, which laissez-faire is French kind of roughly for translates to hands off. This was the idea that the government should be as little involved with the economic workings of a country as possible, that the government should largely just let it be, step in only occasionally when absolutely needed, but in large part let the economy kind of play out on its own. In the second half of the 20th century, governments started to see their views shift into a more hands-on approach. onto economics. They started to let off the laissez-faire thing and started to see, maybe we do need to be a little bit more involved. And I think that's going to come about partly as a consequence of the Great Depression, where, at the beginning of the Great Depression, government's like, well, we don't need to do anything. It'll write itself. The government doesn't need to be involved. But as the Great Depression got worse because they weren't doing anything, the economy was so bad it needed intervention. But as they let it go, it got worse. They started to realize, okay, maybe we do need to get a little bit more involved here if we want to get out of this. And then for the next 2 decades, or even three after the Great Depression, the governments were more keen to involving themselves in the economy to avoid another economic collapse. And this is going to change during the second half of the 20th century with this hands-on approach. And this is going to move into the social and economic realm to meet the needs of a more complex and industrial society. But beginning in the 1980s, this trend began to reverse in the United States and in the United Kingdom when conservative governments took power, such as in the United Kingdom, you had the prime ministership of Margaret Thatcher, and then here in the United States, you had the presidency of Ronald Reagan, both conservatives who were more about getting the government out of people's lives and getting back to that laissez-faire approach, which it's gone off and on today. I think here in the United States, at least, where depending on the political party in power, you either see a laissez-faire approach to the economy or you see a more hands-on approach. Typically, what I've seen is, I think it falls along the lines of Democrats are more keen to have a more hands-on approach to economics. They think the government should be much more involved, whereas Republicans tend to have more of that laissez-faire attitude toward economics. They believe the government should be as little involved as possible and should only get involved when times are needed for them to get involved. And there are times that one is more appropriate than the other, in my opinion. Neither of the two viewpoints is wrong. There's just certain times when one is probably better than the other, but that can shift. Times shift. But that pretty much, I think, wraps up the basics of the first and second, just some of the events that occur here. Now, again, the innovations wise, we're going to do another videos on them. I want to make sure they get a little bit of attention on their own. I don't want to try to squash them into one giant video and they get all jumbled up. So we'll do them on their own video, hopefully next week, if not the week after, if I can't do it next week. But I don't see no reason why we shouldn't be able to. But we'll hopefully get into that next week. And then, right now, as I said at the start of the video, we're technically right now in a third industrial revolution, the digital revolution, where everything is becoming digitized. That is ongoing right now. And we can guess as to the historical impact that will have on the world, but we will not know until it's fully done and over. Sometime in my lifetime, we'll probably figure that out. My generation will probably have to deal with the consequences of whatever comes out of this, and the generation after us. It's already being born. My generation, Generation Z, is in its own impressive because we are the first generation to grow up with technology from birth. It's always been around to our generation, where Generation X before us, the millennials, they grew up when they were kids. Technology wasn't as much. Digital technology and electronics weren't all that common. It wasn't until they, came out of high school, or even I'd say, their college years or a little after their college years, that technology started to come about. And for them, that was a big change. They didn't grow up with it from the start. Where my generation, we have. And that's definitely, it's unforeseen yet how that's going to fully impact ours. But that covers this topic. So, as always, any questions, comments, recommendations, any sort of, suggestion or anything like that, always leave that in the comment section. I look forward to looking through them if they come through. And as for any unresolved business, I don't think we have any. So next week we'll hopefully get on to the innovations of the Industrial Revolution. We'll talk about some of the actual specific, big inventions that come out during this and major things, and we'll move on from there. So until next week, hopefully everyone remains safe and warm during this blustery cold week that's just crazy as crap. Right now in Ohio, it is raining. We just had a slushy start to this morning, and tomorrow it looks like more snow is coming, so I don't know what it's going to look like yet. So hopefully everyone stays safe, warm, and has a good rest of their week. And we'll see you all back here next week for the innovations on the Industrial Revolution. So until then, everyone stay well.